Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the boots of one of the most misunderstood and least envied roles in medieval society, the executioner. That's right, you're not a knight, not a monk, not a lord, but the man who swings the blade. You're the walking paradox of medieval justice, needed, paid and feared, but never touched. Feared by children, shunned by clergy, and paid by the very townspeople who won't make eye contact with you in the market. You're about to find out what it really meant to earn your bread by ending lives not in war, where the church might forgive your killing, but in cold daylight, on public display, surrounded by villagers chewing turnips. Forget the black hood you wore, no mask. Everyone knew your face. They had to. Someone had to do it, and that someone was you. This isn't a story about cruelty. It's about the economic necessity of death, the bodily toll of moral labour, and the weird bureaucratic rituals that made justice feel sacred, even when it was ugly. We'll start with the stench of blood and the sound of the grindstone, and end by zooming out into the strange, terrifying logic that built a whole civilization around the spectacle of death. And let me warn you now, it only gets darker. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The grindstone sings. You push the blade along its whirring edge again, slow and steady, feeling the vibration in your forearm. You've done this so many times, you can measure sharpness by sound alone. Too high-pitched? Still rough. Too low? Too dull. You want a whistle, a whisper of death. That's when it's right. That's when it'll take the head clean, in one merciful stroke. The sun isn't up yet, and the barn smells like old hay, blood and iron. Damp wood creaks above you. The chickens outside are still asleep, and for a moment so is the rest of the world. But you're awake. You have to be. It's execution day. Your body aches in familiar ways, knees stiff, lower back tight, forearms taut from the endless grinding. You'll bathe next, not for comfort, but for ritual. A bath before the act. A shaving of the head. You'll scrub until your skin burns, because you know what they whisper. That you carry sin like a second skin. That your hands are cursed. That even your shadow is unlucky. You reach for the blade old, nicked, well fed on the necks of thieves and rebels, and test it with your thumb. Just a hair's weight, and it nicks you. Good, you need it sharp. You can't afford a messy stroke. Not today, not after last time. Outside, the scaffolding waits in the square, built 3 days ago by town carpenters. You supervised its assembly, made sure the block was solid, that the trapdoor wasn't too loose, that the nails were flush and won't catch on cloth or flesh. You walked the stairs 3 times and jumped on the platform. It groaned, but it held. You measured the rope, again and again. Your clothes are simple, but clean grey wool tunic, leather belt, boots with iron buckles, no mask, never a mask. They need to see you. There's comfort in knowing the hand that does the job. The anonymity of death is for cowards. You are not a coward. You light a candle, not out of superstition, but habit. Old rituals die hard. You say nothing aloud, but you think it anyway. Let it be quick today. That's the only mercy you ever ask for. You eat a bit of bread, wash it down with ale. Nothing heavy. You don't want to vomit later. You've done that before, and it's worse than the blood. That smell sticks with you longer. The bread is stale. You chew anyway. The sun breaks over the hills. pale and pink, like a boiled skull. You hear the bells ring from the chapel, 2 slow tolls, one for the condemned, one for the crowd. You walk the road to the square alone. No one greets you. Even the baker's boy turns his eyes down. But you're used to that. You've learned to live on the edge of town life, not quite banished, not quite welcome. Children are warned not to touch your tools. Women hide their eyes when you pass, but they all come to watch. And that's the part no one wants to admit. They come to watch. They whisper piety, but they love the blood. It's not about justice. It's about certainty, about rhythm. Someone sins. Someone dies. The balance is kept. You reach the platform. Already, a few merchants are setting up behind the crowd line, hawking cider and dried fish. A man sharpens a quill to document the event. The town scribe, maybe. You nod to the guards. They nod back. No one says good morning. Then they bring him out. The condemned, a thief, caught with a noble's ring and a sack of bread. Some say he stole to feed his sister. Others say he's a liar and a drunk. It doesn't matter now. The sentence was read 3 days ago, and the gallows waits. He's younger than you expected, maybe 19. Eyes wide, lips chapped, feet bare. They didn't give him shoes for the walk. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Depends on the mood of the sheriff. He meets your eyes. You don't look away. You don't smile. You don't scowl. You're not here to punish him. You're here to end him. He walks the steps, knees trembling. The priest mutters something you can't hear. The guards bind his hands. You ask the lad gently if he wants to kneel. He does. You raise the blade. The crowd holds its breath. A child coughs. A woman clutches a rosary made of bone. You swing. The sound isn't what you expect. It never is. Not a clean slice like meat, more like chopping into wet rope. The boy's head hits the straw, a spurt of red. Then, stillness. The silence afterward is the worst part. The crowd doesn't cheer. They never do. That's not how this works. They watch, they flinch. They remember why they follow the rules. You clean the blade with a rag you carry for that purpose. It's stained already, but you use it anyway. The guards collect the body. The priest murmurs again. The scribe scratches furiously. You step down. One woman crosses herself as you pass. Another spits at the ground, not at you, but near you. You're used to that too. You return to the barn. You wash your hands again. Even though the blood is mostly dry, you toss the rag into the fire. It hisses. You sit. You breathe. And then you begin again. Because there's always another crime. Always another name. Always another neck. You are not a monster. You are a craftsman. A necessary wound in the body of justice. And tomorrow you sharpen the blade again. They stare at you. The moment the blade drops, it begins the wait of hundreds of eyes. Some flinch, some widen, a few close, but none look away. They're watching to make sure you did it right, to see if you flinched, if you missed, if you enjoyed it too much. You did not flinch. You rarely do anymore. The boy's head landed neatly, rolling half a pace before it settled. His body stayed upright for a heartbeat and eerie stillness, like his spirit hadn't realized yet and then crumpled. The priest caught it by the shoulder to ease the fall, but it wasn't graceful. It never is. You don't linger on the body. That's not your job. That's the bailiff's duty, or sometimes the undertaker, depending on whether the family pays to collect what's left. If they don't, the corpse is taken to the pit, or worse, left on a spike for a week. You descend the scaffold steps slowly, not out of drama, but because your knees are stiff and the wood is slick with mist and blood. Below, 2 boys laugh not from joy, but nerves. They'll be quiet tonight, eyes wide in bed, imagining the sound, that wet, terrible sound. A woman nearby murmurs something to her child. You hear the word justice. You've heard it before. It's a soft word, a neat one. But it doesn't match the stink of open bowels or the pinkish mist that hangs in the air when the wind shifts wrong. You know what the boy did. You read the writ. Theft, they said. But there were other whispers that he struck a noble, maybe, or tried to kiss the reeve's daughter. None of it matters. His name is gone now. Just another on your tally. You wipe your hands again. The blade is already in its linen wrap, soaked slightly where it touched the cloth. You tie the string tightly, like binding a wound. Then you nod to the constable and head down the cobbled lane, away from the crowd. They part for you, like smoke, giving you space without looking directly at your face. Some still call you names butcher, sign-eater, devil's hand. But they whisper it when you're out of earshot. None dare say it loud, not because they fear your strength. You're not a large man, but because deep down they know they need you. Someone has to hold the blade. You pass a merchant stall, dried apples, salted eel. The old woman selling it goes quiet as you approach, eyes fixed on the coins in her hand, pretending she's counting. She doesn't offer you anything, and you don't ask. You used to care, used to ache at the cold shoulders and averted eyes. But now you measure a good day by how few people spit near your feet. You reach the well behind your cottage and draw water. Cold, metallic, you strip to your waist and wash the sweat and gore from your arms, scrubbing hard at the elbow where some of the blood splashed. It's already dried into a sticky patch. You scrub harder until your skin is raw. Back inside, the cottage is dim. The shutters are drawn. No one visits, not since your wife left. You didn't blame her. A carpenter's daughter, she thought the job was honourable. That was before she saw your face after an execution gone wrong, before she heard the screaming that didn't stop, even when the head came off. You light a taper. The flickering flame dances over the wooden beams, casting twisted shadows on the walls. There's no warmth in the room, only function. A stool, a table, a bed of straw. A locked chest with your tools, blades, rope, iron. All cleaned, all legal, all necessary. On the table lies your ledger. You open it. The town's seal is stamped on the first page. Each name beneath is neat, dated, and signed. Today's entry: Thomas of Cray, hanged for theft and insolence, by order of the High Reeve. You write it slowly, carefully. Your hand doesn't shake, it hasn't for years. You eat. Bread again. A wedge of cheese that's begun to sweat. You chew slowly, jaw tight. You do not taste it. You never do on execution days. You sleep for a while, or try to. The dreams come quickly, always the same. A blurred face, eyes open after death. Mouths that move though heads are severed. A voice asking, "Did I deserve it?" You never answer. You don't know the answer. You wake before dusk, heart pounding, palms damp. You splash your face and return to the blade. You unwrap it again, kneel before the grindstone, and begin sharpening once more. Not because it needs it not yet, but because it's the only part of the job that feels clean. The sound is steady, whisper sharp. Your fingers guide the blade like they're tracing scripture. You know the weight of it better than you know the shape of your own dreams. There are worse things than killing. You've seen them. You've ended them. You remember the girl accused of witchery, eyes red from smoke when they dragged her from her cottage. She begged to be hanged, not burned. You argued for her, lost. She screamed for hours. You heard her from the hill, and you could do nothing. You couldn't kill her quickly. That wasn't your job that day. You just watched, like they always do. Later that night, you broke a stool in half with your bare hands. You still have one of the splinters. You don't speak much these days. Not because you're brooding or grim despite what the village children think, but because silence is easier. Words are tricky when death is your trade. You tried to make small talk once with a man in the tavern. He asked what you did. You told him. He left his drink and walked out. You don't go to the tavern anymore. You've considered writing your story, a confession maybe, a ledger of truth instead of names. But what would you say? I do it clean, I make it quick, I sleep poorly and I try not to see their faces. No one wants that. They want either the monster or the martyr. You are neither. You are the blade. And the blade doesn't speak. You stare out the small window. The village is quieter now, children gone indoors, smoke rising from hearths. Soon someone will knock. A summons for the next one. A thief. A heretic. A deserter. Maybe a woman who refused her lord's bed. They'll bring you the writ. They'll hand you your coin. And they won't meet your eyes. You think about running sometimes. About heading west, finding a forest, becoming just another name that disappeared. But where would you go? You'd still be you. Still the hand that held the axe. Even if no one knew your name, you would. No, this is your life, bound to wood and steel and blood, an honest job in a dishonest world. Tomorrow the sun will rise, the grindstone will spin, and you will be ready. Because someone has to be. Someone always has to be. You clean the blade the way a priest might clean a chalice, slow, reverent, methodical. Not because it's sacred, but because you've learned that steel remembers. If you leave even a whisper of blood, even the faintest smear in the notch of the edge, it will rust, it will stink, it will betray you. And when your job depends on steel moving like a thought, that betrayal will cost you more than just a day's wages. So you sit, candlelight flickering in the corner, and you scrub the blade with vinegar, with wool cloth, with fingers so calloused they no longer feel the bite of iron. You talk to it sometimes. Not with words, but with touch, as if the metal knows what it's done, as if it too is waiting for forgiveness. The rag is soaked through now, deep red at first, then a dull rust brown as the hours pass. You fold it carefully and toss it into the clay urn by the hearth. Later, you'll burn it. You always do. Some say that's superstition, that blood on cloth is just waste. But you've seen what happens when you skip the ritual. A boy once refused to burn the cloths. Said he wasn't afraid of curses. Said he wasn't a woman scared of ghosts. A week later, he slipped while carrying the axe and severed the tip of his toe. Infection took the foot, then the leg. He died, screaming about red figures dancing in his room. You burn the cloths now. You turn to the bucket, a heavy one, wooden, with iron hoops. You fill it from the well, and you scrub the block. The same block the boy knelt on this morning. There's still a dark smear there. It smells of meat left too long in the sun. You pour water again. It washes away in streaks, pinkish at first, then clear. The block is stained forever, no matter how many times you clean it. The wood remembers. That's what you hate most about it, the way the grain darkens over time. Like it's been sipping blood, little by little, learning to crave it. You return the tools to the chest, the axe, the rope, the branding iron, used less often these days, but still part of the kit. Each piece rests in its own slot, carved just for it. Like a coffin for steel. You sit on the stool, and for a moment, you just breathe. You think of the boy's eyes, not in death, in the moment before, when he looked up, lips trembling, and asked you, "Does it hurt?" You told him no, you lied, not to be cruel, but because the truth is worse. It does hurt, for a second, sometimes two. If you miss the mark, the nerves go wild. There's pain, not always from the axe, sometimes from the way the body fights it, the way the heart pumps after the head is gone, the way the jaw clenches. You've seen mouths open, soundless. You've seen fingers twitch after the breath has stopped. You lied because it was kinder. That's the irony of your trade. You're not there to kill, you're there to do it clean. A dirty death is worse than sin. It's failure, it's shame, it brings questions. And you can't afford questions. You lay back on your straw bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. You trace the cracks in the wood, the knots, the spots where termites once burrowed, anything to avoid the faces that swim behind your eyelids. You don't sleep yet. You wait for the knock. It always comes, a few hours after the act. Payment. Sure enough, there it is. A soft rap, 3 knocks, a pause. Then one more. You rise, fast but quiet. You open the door. A boy stands there, no older than 13, pale, shaking slightly, holding a pouch in one hand and a strip of parchment in the other. He doesn't meet your eyes. You take both. Nod, say nothing. He nods back, turns, and walks away like he's just delivered a message to the devil. You close the door. The pouch jingles. It's heavier than usual. You open it. 12 silver pennies. 3 more than expected. You check the parchment. A bonus for cleanliness. The reeve was pleased. Your hands tighten. Pleased. That's the word they use. Not grateful, not relieved, just pleased. Like you were a juggler and didn't drop the ball. Like it was a performance and the applause was silver. You pocket the coin. You don't count it again. You've done enough counting today. You eat cold porridge, stale again. You chew slowly, each bite like ash. Your teeth ache, not from rot, your mouth is clean. You make sure of it. It aches from clenching. From the way your jaw locks each time you lift the axe. You've cracked molars that way. You lie down again. You light no candle. The dark is kinder. It blurs the memories, softens the edges. You dream. This time, it's the girl again. The one burned. But in the dream, she's laughing. Her mouth full of smoke. She reaches out, and when she touches your cheek, her fingers are cinders. You wake gasping, the smell of charred meat still thick in your nose. It's past midnight. You rise, you pour more water, you wash your face. You sit. You wait. There's always another writ, another neck, another boy with eyes too wide for his face. You live alone for a reason. Once, a woman came to you after her brother's execution, asked if he said anything before, asked if he cried, asked if you forgave him. You told her the truth. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. And forgiveness isn't yours to give. She slapped you. Then she wept. Then she kissed your hand. You never saw her again. You write in your second ledger, the private one, not for the town, just for you. No names, just numbers. A quiet little tally. This morning made 94. You close the book. You place it beneath the floorboard. You sharpen the blade again, not because it's dull, but because the ritual matters. Each scrape of steel over stone is a prayer now. You wonder if the saints would recognize it. Probably not. But you're not doing this for the saints. You're doing it for the ones who don't get to choose, for the ones who didn't die clean, for the ones whose eyes still visit you in dreams. You're doing it because someone has to. Someone always has to. The executioner was paid in silver, but he lived in shadows. In 14th century England, to kill by the state's command was not seen as noble. It was not gallant swordplay or battlefield valor. It was low work, dirty work. The kind of labor that needed to be done but could never be celebrated. Executioners were not honored. They were tolerated, sometimes even pitied, but never fully human in the eyes of the towns they served. The irony was bitter and ancient. He was essential, but untouchable. If he walked into a church, he was offered the back bench, if he was allowed in at all. His tools were not blessed, but feared. His home was often just outside the village limits, and his touch was believed to carry a spiritual stain. Children were told not to speak to him. Widows crossed themselves when he passed. If he tried to buy from a stall, the merchant might lay the goods down on the table rather than hand them directly into his palm. There were exceptions, of course, drunken nights when a man wanted to hear the details of a hanging, or times when politics got bloody and the executioner became briefly useful to those in power. But these moments never lasted. Respect for the blade was not the same as respect for the hand that held it. He was unclean. That was the word they used over and over again. Not dirty, not wicked unclean in the scriptural sense. Like a leper or a gravedigger. Like a midwife who had seen too much blood. It wasn't about morality. It was about proximity to death, to the breaking of bodies, to fluids and prayers and gasping last words. Some towns went so far as to ban their executioners from taverns and bathhouses. Others required them to wear distinct colours or bells on their shoes. And yet they could not do without him. The punishment system of the medieval world was built on theatre, on spectacle, on visibility. The very effectiveness of justice depended on the people watching it happen, on peasants and merchants and wayward sons standing in the square to witness a thief swing, or a heretic burn, or a noble kneel beneath a blade. But here's the rub. The more central execution became to public life, the more people needed to pretend they didn't enjoy it. They told themselves they came to the gallows out of duty, to be reminded of virtue, to see the cost of crime. But they stayed for the same reason you slow down when passing a wreck horror, yes, but also hunger. A craving for blood, for closure, for that sick little flutter of gratitude that they weren't the one dying. And so the executioner became a kind of scapegoat for their own fascination. They could blame him for the gore. He was the reason it felt dirty. Not the system, not the crowd, him. He was the vessel for their guilt. He often inherited the job. In some places, the role passed down from father to son, like a curse sealed in blood. In others, it was assigned to a criminal who chose service over death do the job, and the rope you were meant to hang from would be handed to someone else. There are records of men in the role who changed their names, who relocated constantly, who drank themselves into oblivion by 40. Some lasted longer. They developed tricks, meditation, prayer, muttering Latin phrases they only half understood anything to convince themselves they weren't damned. And yet, not all executioners were broken men. Some thrived in the role. They learned to walk a strange line, quiet, firm, efficient, not cruel, not proud, just necessary. They took pride in clean work, in the art of it. They became surgeons of punishment. In London, one such man, Thomas Highgate, was known for his precision. Never botched a beheading. Insisted on silence during the act. He kept notes, sharpened his blades with obsessive care, and was said to weep after every child he was ordered to whip. He lived alone in a house with a tiled floor, rare, expensive, and never married. His tools were buried with him in a box sealed with wax and bone. His gravestone reads only, "He did what was required." It wasn't just the public who viewed executioners with suspicion. The church had an uneasy relationship with them too. On paper, their work served justice, and justice was divine. But in practice, they handled death without sacrament. They operated in the grey space between sacred and profane. An executioner could rarely receive communion. A priest might refuse him burial in consecrated ground. And if he sought confession, he might be told to walk 3 parishes away and find a priest who didn't know his name. Theologically, this made no sense. He was not a murderer. He was a servant of the law. But in the medieval imagination, the line between sacred death and sinful killing was drawn in blood, and executioners were soaked in it. Some towns tried to address this contradiction with rituals. In one village, the local priest would sprinkle the executioner's tools with holy water once a month. In another, he would be required to fast for 3 days before a major execution and receive a blessing at dawn, not for his soul, but so that the town could tell itself the killing was clean. Then there were the masks. The hooded headsman, tall, faceless, terrifying. It's the image most people conjure when they think of medieval execution. But in truth, most never wore hoods at all. Hoods got in the way. They obscured vision, made the blade less accurate. Besides, the crowd wanted to see his face. They wanted to know who had done the deed. The mask was a lie born centuries later, more theatrical than real. In places where hoods were used, it was sometimes to protect the executioner not from shame, but from vengeance. If a noble was executed, his family might seek retribution. A hood was not for modesty. It was for survival. The executioner stood at the fulcrum of a twisted moral machine. He was proof that society could not exist without blood. That order was maintained by violence. That safety came not from mercy, but from the threat of pain. And that the people, the good, pious people, needed someone to bear that burden for them, to make the system work without forcing them to admit what it cost. So he lived outside the town, and outside the law, and outside the grace of God, and he did what no one else would. He severed necks so that others could hold theirs high. He swung the blade so that no one else had to get their hands dirty. And in doing so, he carried not just the weight of the axe, but the unbearable, unspoken truth of his time. That justice, in the end, is never clean. Every hanging cost someone coin. The rope itself wasn't free. Neither was the scaffold, or the nails that held it, or the guards who dragged the condemned through the square, or the men who stood in the crowd selling roasted chestnuts and old wine to onlookers with bored expressions and bloody expectations. An execution wasn't just a punishment. It was an event, and like all events, it had a budget. The medieval justice system was built on spectacle, not because it was moral, but because it was effective. The public death served as both conclusion and warning a way to draw a bloody red line between us and them. But behind that symbolism was a practical, grinding machine of economics. Justice wasn't just carried out, it was paid for. And someone had to do the math. Take a town of average size, say, a few hundred households, 24 trades, and a lord who demanded his pound of loyalty through taxes and presents. When someone committed a crime, the first cost was time. The reeve or constable had to investigate. Witnesses had to be questioned, confessions extracted, by persuasion or pain, scribes hired to record it all in ink that wasn't cheap. Then came the trial conducted in Latin, full of pageantry and posture. After that, assuming a sentence of death was passed, a whole separate set of wheels began turning. First came materials. Ropes had to be cut and measured hemp, usually, boiled and stretched for durability. If it was a hanging, the drop had to be calculated based on the weight of the condemned. Too short, and they choked for minutes. Too long, and the head tore free. Neither was ideal. A clean break at the neck, the C2 vertebra, that was the goal. There was an art to that length. A science even. And science required time, and time required silver. Then came construction. Some towns had permanent gallows, large, crude, T-shaped wooden structures, often placed at crossroads or just outside the city walls. These were cheaper in the long run, but required upkeep. Others built fresh scaffolds for each execution, usually in the market square or town green. The wood was often reused, the nails pulled and hammered back into place again and again until they bent. Carpenters did the work. They didn't like it, but they took the coin. Next, the guards. They had to escort the condemned from the jail to the scaffold. They needed pikes, armor, wages, and the authority to push back a crowd if things turned ugly. And things did turn ugly, more often than not. Families begging for mercy, drunks throwing mud, children daring one another to touch the dead after the deed was done. And, of course, the executioner. His fee varied, some charged by the head, others by the method. Hanging was simple. Beheading required skill. Burning, that was a spectacle and dangerous. The fire had to be fed. The platform reinforced. The wood chosen carefully. Green wood smoked too much. Dry wood burned too fast. You wanted a slow, terrifying blaze. Something that made a statement. Executioners didn't just kill, they performed. And the better the show, the higher the coin. And what about the body? Disposal came next. If the family paid, they might retrieve the corpse for burial. But many could not, or would not. A criminal body was bad luck. Touching it could mark your house as cursed. If left to the town, the corpse might be dragged to a pit outside the city, or strung up on display, a warning to others. Heads were placed on spikes, thieves' hands nailed to gates, tongues of liars stuffed with straw and hung from trees. Each of these rituals cost money: wood, nails, labor, transportation. Some towns kept a special budget line for execution days. Literally, a line in the records that read, "For the hanging of," or "In payment to the man of the rope." There are surviving records from towns like York and Norwich, listing the price of iron shackles, the fee for carrying the body, and even tips paid to those who kept order during the hanging. And if you think the church had nothing to do with it, think again. In theory, the church was a voice of mercy. Priests begged for repentance. Monks prayed for souls. But in practice, they were deeply embedded in the machinery of death. A priest was always present at executions, offering final rites, sometimes offering comfort, though more often urging confession. The church wanted the condemned to die in a state of grace, not for the sake of the man, but for the reputation of the town. A repentant sinner made for better optics. In some places, the church even funded the gallows, or helped select the executioner, or offered land for disposal of the remains. A tidy arrangement. Everyone played their part. It wasn't just criminals who found themselves on the scaffold. Political dissenters, religious radicals, women accused of witchcraft or adultery. Anyone who stepped outside the brittle social order could find their feet tied and their face covered. The punishment wasn't just about what they'd done, it was about who they were. A noble might be allowed the sword clean, fast, dignified. A commoner would get the rope. A woman accused of heresy, fire, and, let's not forget, mutilation. You didn't always die. Sometimes you lost a hand, or an ear, or the tip of your nose. Sometimes your tongue was cut out. These were cheaper punishments, no need for scaffold or rope, just a sharp knife and a public square. You were made a warning. You became walking evidence of the law's reach. Even the crowd played a part in the economy of death. They brought bread and ale. They bought souvenirs. They wagered on whether the condemned would cry or piss himself or vomit. They passed judgment loudly. They taught their children to look so they would know what happens to bad men or women or poor men in the wrong place. This wasn't just punishment. It was ritual. It was theatre. It was governance by fear, and fear had invoices. And beneath it all, the executioner kept his ledger, not just of names, but of payments, of wood purchased, of assistants hired, of rag and vinegar and time spent scrubbing away what the town refused to see. Because when the blood stopped flowing, someone had to sweep. When the crowd left, someone had to store the rope. When the death was done, someone had to carry its cost. And more often than not, that someone lived alone, on the edge of town, with calloused hands and a heavy chest of iron tools. He wasn't just the killer. He was the clerk of consequence. It didn't end all at once. There was no grand proclamation, no final swinging of the axe where the crowd rose in applause and declared the age of blood over. Instead, the decline of the executioner came slowly, one reform, one quiet law, one reshaped cultural horror at a time. In 14th century England, he was essential. By the 18th, he was an embarrassment. What changed? Part of it was the evolution of the state itself. As monarchies grew more centralized and bureaucracy deepened its roots in Europe, justice became less theatrical and more administrative. The town square gave way to courtrooms. The scaffold began to look less like a moral altar and more like a political liability. There were still executions, of course. In fact, during the height of the so-called Bloody Code, in 18th century England, hundreds of crimes carried the death penalty, some for theft, others for property damage. But even then, a shift was happening. The blood didn't vanish, but the appetite for watching it began to wane. The crowds became less respectful, more restless. In some cities, riots broke out during executions. In others, the condemned were cheered, not condemned. There are records of women fainting at the sight of a child hanged, of clergymen questioning whether public punishment was still spiritually effective, of nobility pushing for more private methods of death, and still the executioner endured. By this point, he was no longer the faceless wretch of earlier centuries. He was often state-employed, with fixed wages and formal duties. In some regions, he even had a uniform. The French called him Monsieur de Paris. In Prussia, he had a pension. In London, he had an office in Newgate Prison and access to city funds for supplies. But the stigma remained. Even at the height of his bureaucratic respectability, the executioner was still kept at arm's length. He was tolerated, not trusted, necessary, not welcomed. He could take life legally, but he could not wash away the smell it left on him. It clung in church, in marriage prospects, in every small town inn that asked his name too casually. Some leaned into it, others fled from it. There are stories of men who changed their names every 5 years, traveling between counties, performing executions under false titles. Some took on apprentices, a few even published memoirs. One London hangman, William Calcraft, became infamous not for efficiency, but for the opposite. His hangings were so poorly calculated that they often led to slow, choking deaths. But even he was paid well, and his tenure long. Meanwhile, in the background, reformers were whispering. The Enlightenment had dawned, and with it came new ideas. Human dignity, prison reform, the possibility that justice could be clean and death could be unnecessary. Cesare Beccaria, the Italian criminologist, argued in the mid-18th century that the death penalty was not only morally flawed, but statistically useless. Others followed. The narrative changed. Where death had once been a public ceremony meant to restore order, it became something shameful, a sign that society had failed. It wasn't that people became more merciful, necessarily, but they became more uncomfortable with blood in the streets. So the gallows moved, first to the outskirts of town, then behind prison walls, then into basements. Eventually, they gave way to other methods: guillotines, bullets, gas, faster, more humane, less visible, less emotional, more sterile. The executioner adapted, as he always had. In France, during the Revolution, he became a symbol of equality. The guillotine was supposed to be democratic. The noble and the peasant met the same end. But even then, the man who dropped the blade became a ghost. Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of Paris, beheaded thousands. He kept records, tried to maintain dignity, even expressed remorse. But when the terror ended, he too faded. In England, public executions were finally abolished in the mid-19th century. The last public hanging was in 1868. After that, executions were carried out in prisons, away from public eyes. Fewer people knew the executioner's name. His face was hidden. His title became bureaucratic, official, civil servant, state functionary. By the 20th century, most of Europe had either abolished capital punishment or restricted it so heavily that the role of executioner disappeared altogether. But here's the strange thing. Even as he vanished from real life, the executioner thrived in cultural memory. He became a symbol, a mask, a stock character in books, plays, and films. Grim, silent, hooded, sometimes a monster, sometimes a reluctant hero, always standing just behind the curtain, waiting for his cue. People feared him and missed him, not because they wanted his job, but because he represented something they didn't know how to replace: consequence. The modern world, with all its laws and prisons and forms and appeals, began to feel too clean. Justice felt remote, impersonal, slow, and in that slow drift toward abstraction, the figure of the executioner, crude, immediate, terrifying, gained a kind of nostalgic power. He had been many things: butcher, priest, surgeon, monster, scapegoat. He had killed, by blade, by rope, by fire. He had stood at the center of civic morality and at the edge of society. And when he disappeared, no one quite knew how to talk about death anymore. What does it mean to be just? What does it mean to suffer? To be punished, publicly, for a crime that everyone must see to believe? These questions still linger, not because we want answers, but because we don't. Because buried deep in the vaults of collective memory is a wooden scaffold, a heavy axe, and a man who sharpens it in the dark. He's not evil. He's just necessary. And in a strange way, the more civilized we become, the more his shadow stretches beneath us, a reminder that once, not so long ago, justice wore a hood, lived alone, and slept beside a chest of tools. And someone had to swing the blade. Moctezuma, too, was not born in ruins. He was born in gold. Born around the year 1466, son of the Aztec nobility, nephew to emperors and priests, he was not just raised to rule, he was sculpted for it. Raised within the warrior orders, trained in poetry, astronomy, religion, and war, he spoke multiple languages and knew the flow of tribute from lands hundreds of miles beyond Tenochtitlan. He knew the stars. He knew the gods. He knew that blood fed the sun. And more than anything else, he knew the weight of empire. By the time he ascended the throne in 1406, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger, sat atop one of the most complex civilizations on the continent, the Triple Alliance, a ruthless coalition of 3 city-states that ruled much of central Mesoamerica through intimidation, economic domination, and a deeply spiritualized form of violence. He inherited a society built on ritual death, solar cycles, sacred warfare, and a network of vassal cities who paid tribute in jade, feathers, obsidian, and flesh. To rule the Aztecs was to become semi-divine. Moctezuma wasn't merely a king. He was a Tlatoani, the great speaker, the living axis between the heavens and the earth. When he opened his mouth, the words were not just law, they were cosmic balance. To see him was to witness the favor of the gods, and yet he became the last of his kind. What went wrong? To understand that, you must understand what kind of ruler he was. Moctezuma was not a tyrant, not in the traditional sense. He was distant, yes. He elevated ceremony to heights even his predecessors hadn't reached. He transformed the royal court into a kind of temple. He purified his servants with obsidian blades, demanded silence in his presence, consulted auguries before every major act. But to the people of Tenochtitlan, he was a man of deep learning, a philosopher king. He restructured the nobility, created new offices, professionalized the priesthood. He raised taxes, some say too harshly, but used the revenues to build temples, store grain, fortify the causeways that stretched across Lake Texcoco like stone arms. Under his rule, Tenochtitlan reached new heights of splendor. The marketplaces boomed, the canals shimmered, tribute flowed in from hundreds of cities. But with growth came fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of imbalance, fear that the gods, who had once allowed the Aztecs to rise from swamp dwellers to imperial masters, might turn their eyes elsewhere. And so Moctezuma looked to the sky. The Aztecs believed time moved in cycles, that history repeated itself in predictable, divine rotations, that empires rose and fell not by politics, but by celestial decree. And by the early 16th century, the calendar had begun to whisper warnings. There were omens. First, a tongue of fire appeared in the night sky. A comet, maybe, a sign of celestial unrest. Then, the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the war god, caught fire without cause. The lake boiled. Lightning struck stone. A woman wandered the city crying, "My children, we must flee far away." Moctezuma listened. He asked his priests what it meant. They didn't know. He asked his astronomers. They found no pattern. He fasted. He wept. He prayed. And then came word from the coast. Strange men had arrived, pale, bearded, clad in metal, riding beasts that had never walked the Valley of Mexico, carrying sticks that roared like thunder. Some said they were gods. Others said they were omens. Moctezuma wasn't sure, but he felt the weight of time press upon his shoulders. He sent them gifts, gold, jade, embroidered cloaks, a test, a greeting, a mistake. The strangers were Spaniards, led by Hernán Cortés, and the gifts told them exactly what they needed to know, that Tenochtitlan was rich, organized, and worth taking. Moctezuma did not attack. He did not send armies to the coast. Instead, he sent envoys, wrote messages, prayed harder. He wanted answers, not war. He feared disruption more than conquest. Historians have debated his motives for centuries. Some say he thought Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl returned, fulfilling a prophecy of divine return. Others argue that he understood the threat but misread the scale of it. He knew conquest, but he had never seen horses, never seen steel that could cleave obsidian, never seen cannons. And more dangerously, he had never seen an empire whose soldiers did not care about the gods. The Aztecs fought for captives, for sacrifice, for glory. The Spaniards fought to annihilate. They fought not to balance the world, but to remake it. When Cortés finally marched inland, Moctezuma sent diplomats to greet him. The emperor offered alliance, shelter, tokens of peace. Cortés smiled, took the gifts, and marched forward anyway. When he arrived in Tenochtitlan, the emperor welcomed him. The city was breathtaking, larger than any in Europe at the time. It shimmered with white stone temples and floating gardens. The air smelled of maize and smoke and perfume. The canals bustled with trade. The temples dripped with incense and blood. And yet, Moctezuma the Tatoani, the god-touched king, brought the Spaniards into his palace, housed them, fed them, honored them. Why? Some say he hoped to turn them into allies. Others believe he thought they were divine, or at least that the appearance of divinity meant they must be handled like gods. He may have believed that if the invaders were part of a prophecy, then his only choice was to submit and hope to guide their purpose. But Cortés had other plans. Within weeks, Moctezuma was a prisoner in his own palace. Held under honorable guard, he was still the great speaker, but his voice had no weight. The Spaniards used him to pacify the people, to keep up appearances, to buy time. And when the Aztec people rose in rebellion, it was Moctezuma they turned on. In one of history's crueler ironies, the emperor who had given everything to preserve his empire, caution, diplomacy, gold, humility, became the scapegoat for its fall. When he stepped out onto a balcony to plead for calm, they hurled stones at him. Some say he died of those wounds. Others say he was killed later by his captors when he outlived his usefulness. Either way, he died as he had lived, isolated by reverence, trapped by prophecy. The fall of Tenochtitlan came quickly after. Disease, betrayal, siege. The empire crumbled. The temples were looted. The obsidian knives were dulled by rust and rain. Spanish priests burned the codices. Spanish swords ended the bloodlines. But Moctezuma remained not in life, but in memory. To the Spaniards, he became a symbol of fatal nobility, a tragic king, too indecisive to resist. To later Mexicans, he was seen alternately as a traitor or a victim, the man who welcomed the destroyers. But to the gods, who can say? Perhaps they watched in silence as their chosen emperor bent beneath the weight of centuries, trying to read omens in a sky that had already made its decision. Perhaps they knew the truth before he did. That time moves in circles, and that every empire, no matter how golden, must eventually become a ruin. The Aztec Empire was not held together by love. It was held together by blood, feathers, and corn, by obsidian knives and jaguar skins, by tribute carried over mountains, through jungles, across rivers in baskets, woven so tightly they squeaked when touched. It was an empire fed by ritual and enforced through fear, and while Moctezuma sat on the obsidian throne, the machine never stopped grinding. He was not alone. Beneath the Tlatoani stretched a vast lattice of administrators, warriors, priests, merchants, and messengers, all bound together by a single sacred demand: keep the sun moving. Because if the sun ever stopped, if the blood did not flow, if the hearts were not lifted high in smoke and song, the world would end. That was not a metaphor. It was cosmological fact. To the Aztecs, the world had ended before, 4 times actually. Each sun destroyed in fire, wind, jaguars, or flood. They lived in the age of the 5th sun, a fragile, trembling epoch balanced on sacrifice. So they sacrificed. And that sacrifice was the engine of the state. The heart of the Aztec economy was not coin, it was tribute. Each city-state under Aztec control owed its masters specific goods: cacao, cotton, obsidian, copper axes, salt, jade, quetzal feathers, human lives. Every item was catalogued, expected, enforced. The empire kept records on long scrolls of deerskin and paper, meticulously painted by scribes who knew exactly how many cloaks should arrive from Cuetlaxtlan in the east or maize sacks from the Huastec coast. And if the tribute didn't arrive, war. But not war as we imagine it, not annihilation, not scorched earth campaigns to erase the enemy. Aztec war was ritual, purposeful, a blood negotiation. They called it Sokiar Oyotl, flower war, beautiful, deadly, designed not to destroy, but to yield captives for sacrifice. These battles were prearranged, dates set, limits agreed upon, rules followed. A strange chivalry governed the violence. Nobles fought nobles, warriors wore identifying costumes, and prisoners were prized more than kills. A dead enemy was a waste. A living one could scream on a temple step and satisfy the sun. It was a closed circuit of death and glory. One fed the other. Warriors earned prestige, not through victory, but through how many captives they brought home. The more prisoners you captured, the higher your rank, the more elaborate your costume, the finer your house. Some warriors even wore the flayed skin of enemies, drying, cracking, stinking, as a badge of honor. The highest rank? Jaguar Knight. They were walking gods, men who stalked into battle clad in spotted pelts, obsidian clubs raised high. Children lined the streets to watch them pass. And above them all, Moctezuma. He received the tribute. He received the captives. But he also carried the weight. Every new conquest brought new enemies. Every new vassal city, another set of tributes to monitor. And under his reign, the empire grew bloated, heavy, fragile. The southern provinces whispered rebellion. The eastern coasts resisted payment. The Texcocans watched their ally with growing suspicion. Tenochtitlan's own neighbors, the Tlaxcalans, remained fiercely independent, refusing every alliance offer, engaging the Aztecs in a perpetual blood feud that lasted generations. All of it worked until it didn't. Tribute was extracted through violence and fear, but fear has a half-life, and when word came that pale men from the east had arrived, wielding lightning and immune to obsidian, that half-life expired. Suddenly, cities that had paid Moctezuma for decades saw a chance to flip the table. The Tlaxcalans allied with the Spaniards, so did the Totonacs. So did many others, quietly, in shadows, and secret meetings. Moctezuma had ruled by divine legitimacy, a man who could not be overthrown without angering the gods. But when those gods failed to stop the invaders, when the temples were defiled, and still no lightning struck the Spanish dead, the illusion cracked. The tribute system crumbled with it, and what had once been a smooth system of movement feathers in, blood out became chaos. No tribute meant no sacrifices. No sacrifices meant the sun might die. The metaphysical threat rippled across the priesthood. Panic spread. Some priests called for mass sacrifice to appease the gods. Others blamed Moctezuma's softness, his hospitality to strangers. The balance was lost. And yet, even as it collapsed, the machine kept trying to feed itself. Temples still burned incense. Warriors still painted their faces black and red. The drums still echoed over Lake Texcoco as hearts were lifted skyward and blood ran down the steps. Even with Spanish ships on the shore, even with gunpowder rattling the mountain air, they kept believing. Because the alternative, that it had all been for nothing, was too heavy to bear. Gold played a strange role in all of this. To the Aztecs, gold was sacred. They called it Teoquitlatl, excrement of the gods. Not a symbol of wealth, but of divine beauty. It glittered like the sun. It adorned statues, temples, ritual knives. It was not used to buy things. It was shown, worn, offered. But to the Spanish, it was something else entirely. It was currency. It was motive. It was worth sailing across oceans, burning cities, and murdering kings. When Moctezuma sent gold as a diplomatic gift, he unknowingly announced, "We are rich, we are ready for plunder." And once that signal went out, the blood could not stop flowing. Not from temple tops, but from empire itself. By the time Hernan Cortés stood at the edge of Lake Texcoco, staring across the water at the shimmering causeways of Tenochtitlan, he was no longer just a stranger. He was the storm. Not because of his men there were fewer than 1,000 Spaniards with him, most bone-thin from disease and the march through unfamiliar lands, but because of who walked behind them. Tens of thousands of native warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, Cholula, and other cities that had once bent the knee to Moctezuma now marched under Spanish command. This was not a war of Europe against Mesoamerica. This was a civil war wrapped in conquest, a long simmering fury unleashed by a foreign catalyst. And Tenochtitlan was the prize. The city was an impossible thing built on an island in the center of a massive, shallow lake, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways. Canals crisscrossed it like veins. Temples rose at its heart like jagged teeth. The streets were clean, the markets teeming, the aqueducts flowing with fresh mountain water. It was a marvel of urban design, and it was doomed. The siege began in May of 1521. It didn't start with cannon fire. It started with betrayal. Cortés had once been inside the city. Months earlier, he'd been welcomed, fed, lodged in Moctezuma's palace. He'd seen the markets, tasted the cacao, admired the golden statues. Then it all unravelled first, with the killing of unarmed Aztec nobles during a festival, then with Moctezuma's mysterious death, and finally with a nighttime escape gone wrong that left Spanish bodies floating in the lake. Cortés had tasted blood and loss. Now he wanted revenge. He returned with ships. Small brigantines, 13 of them built from timbers, hauled over mountains and reassembled on the lake shore, floating weapons. The lake, once Tenochtitlan's moat and lifeline, was now a trap. He blockaded the causeways. He cut the aqueducts. He poisoned the lake with corpses. The siege was slow, brutal, biblical. Inside the city, Cuauhtémoc Moctezuma's successor, barely 25 years old, rallied the people. Warriors fought from rooftops, hurled stones from canoes, set ambushes in alleyways. Women and children carried water, food, messages, weapons. The city did not fold, but it starved, and thirsted, and drowned. Lake Texcoco, once so clean it sparkled, turned into a soup of rot. The aqueducts had been cut. Canoes carrying food were intercepted and sunk. The causeways became gauntlets exposed and narrow, easy to ambush, easy to burn. So they ate what they could, roots, bark, rats, then grass, then leather. There are accounts whispered, mostly of people eating the dead. Not for ritual. For survival. Disease followed. Smallpox had already carved a path through the empire months before, spread by a single infected African slave in the Spanish camp. Now it bloomed. Boils erupted. Fever scorched the city. The priests said the gods were punishing them for letting the invaders live this long. But the gods were silent. Temples still reeked of blood. Hearts were still lifted. But the sun no longer felt like it listened. Cortés advanced, street by street. The Spaniards learned, adapted, tore up the bridges behind them, used native allies as shields, burned what they could not hold. Aztec resistance turned from formal battle to shadow war, assassinations, night raids, poisoned food. But with each week, the circle tightened. The sacred city became a maze of rubble, smoke, and dying dreams. Still Cuauhtémoc fought. Still the people refused surrender. Even as the canals turned black and the pyramids were shelled by Spanish cannon, even when the causeways were littered with corpses, and the nobles were gone, and the drums of war could no longer be heard above the coughing, even when the eagles were silent. It ended in August. Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee in a canoe to gather support from the few unconquered cities to the south. He was captured before he reached shore. They brought him to Cortés. He stood barefoot, dressed in rags, his face gaunt from hunger, but his eyes were hard. "I have done what was my duty," he said. "Now take your knife and finish me." Cortés did not kill him. Not yet. He needed him alive. For appearances. For leverage. For something like legitimacy. But Cuauhtémoc's survival was not mercy. It was theatre. He would be tortured, forced to reveal hidden treasures, burned until he talked, and then hanged years later on suspicion of treason. Tenochtitlan was gone. Its temples flattened, its gods decapitated, its streets reeked of smoke and ash. The sacred lake, once shimmering under the sun, now stank of decay. Over the bones of that empire, a new city was built, Mexico City. Spanish stones on Aztec foundations, Catholic churches where the old gods once drank blood. A new empire, birthed from the corpse of the last. And still, the survivors whispered. About the Golden Age, about Moctezuma, about omens and stars, and the moment the sun stopped listening. They didn't forget. Because you don't forget the sound of a city dying. You don't forget the taste of ash. And you don't forget that once there was a lake. And in the center of that lake there was a city of gods. And it fell. The gods were always watching. Not in judgment, not in mercy, but in hunger. To be Aztec was to live under a sky filled with teeth celestial mouths waiting to devour the world if they were not fed. And what they hungered for most wasn't gold or prayer or incense, it was blood. Aztec religion was not metaphorical, it was mechanical. The universe, they believed, had already died 4 times. Each age was born, flourished, and collapsed under divine catastrophe. Jaguars, wind, fire, water. The current age, the fifth sun, was no more permanent than the ones before it. It required fuel, and that fuel came from the hearts of men. To us, this sounds horrific, barbaric. But to the Aztecs, it was maintenance, a cosmic obligation. Just as a farmer turns the soil or a builder lays a beam, the priest lifted the obsidian knife to keep the sun from falling out of the sky. They did not kill out of cruelty. They killed out of need. At the heart of it all was Teotl, an animating force that moved through gods, humans, fire, breath, speech, blood. The Aztec world was sacredly unstable, always on the brink of collapse, unless ritually restored. And the human body? That was the most potent vessel of Teotl, especially the heart, especially when it was still beating. The rituals were not random. They followed strict calendars, solar, lunar, Venusian, all interlocking like gears. There were more than 18 months in an Aztec year, each with its own festival. Sacrifice was seasonal, rhythmic. Sometimes it required animals, sometimes food. But the greatest ceremonies called for humans. Captured warriors were best, willing victims better still. Yes, some victims climbed the stairs willingly, believing they were about to become gods. To die on the Templo Mayor was to become part of the stars. Not everyone wept. Some smiled, some danced. The architecture reflected the faith. Temples were not just buildings. They were mountains, replicas of the cosmic center, where creation began, sacred geography carved in stone. The great temple of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor, had 2 shrines at its summit, one to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and one to Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Sun and rain, fire and water, life and death. Rituals there were terrifyingly beautiful. Drums echoed like thunder. Priests dressed in flayed skins and jaguar pelts. Incense billowed into the air, mixing with the scent of blood and roasted maize. The sacrificial victims were painted blue, crowned with feathers, led up the 100+ steps. At the top, 4 assistants held the limbs. The chest was cut open with a blade of obsidian, and the heart was lifted high to the sun. Sometimes it was placed in a ceremonial vessel, sometimes fed to a statue, sometimes burned. The body was then tossed down the steps, not as waste, as completion. Everything had purpose. There were sacrifices to ensure rain, to defeat drought, to consecrate temples, to accompany royal burials. Some were children, chosen for their innocence, made to cry so that Tlaloc, the rain god, would hear their tears and weep with his own bringing storms. The gods were not gentle. They were forces primal, vast, unpredictable. Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent, patron of wisdom and wind, a gentle counterbalance to the more bloodthirsty gods, and yet even he demanded offerings. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was shadow and sorcery, war and deception. Sheep Totec wore human skin as a sign of rebirth. Mictlantecutli ruled the underworld, bones clenched between his teeth. The pantheon was crowded, the cosmos densely populated, but the unifying thread was balance. The gods gave crops, breath, order, and in return, humans had to give back. Even the Aztec creation myth was rooted in self-sacrifice. At the beginning of this age, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan. They had created the 5th sun, but it would not move unless one of them jumped into fire. The sickly, pockmarked god Nanahuatzin leapt. His body became the sun. Another followed, and became the moon. Even the stars had bled for the world. How, then, could humans do any less? Sacrifice wasn't punishment, it was participation. And for the Aztecs, that logic saturated every corner of daily life. Midwives whispered prayers to newborns that they might die in battle or childbirth, the two noblest ends. Farmers offered first harvests to the gods. Warriors fought not for land, but for captives. Dying in battle meant rebirth in the east, where the sun rose in glory. Dying in childbirth, the same. Women who died in labor were believed to haunt crossroads, wailing like spirits, holy in their pain. The entire empire pulsed with blood and belief. But there was something more subtle, more tragic, because even as the rituals continued, even as hearts were lifted to the sun, there was fear, a quiet, gnawing anxiety. What if it's not enough? What if the gods were not merely hungry, but angry? What if the sacrifices had become routine, less sacred, more bureaucratic? What if conquest had grown too wide, tribute too greedy, rituals too many, and belief too stretched? What if they had failed to honor the old ways? When the omens came, comets, flames, cries, in the night some said it was punishment, that the sun was faltering, that the calendar would soon reset, that the age of the fifth sun was ending. And when the strangers arrived, clad in steel, and speaking of another god, one who did not require hearts, only faith, the Aztecs were shaken. Not because they were weak, but because they listened. They knew what happened when you ignored the signs. Some priests resisted, others adapted. Some tried to place the Christian God within their own framework. Perhaps he was Quetzalcoatl returned. Perhaps he was another face of Tezcatlipoca. But the old gods were silent. The temples were sacked, the priests slaughtered, the sacred flames extinguished. The rituals stopped, and with them, the entire worldview collapsed. Because in the Aztec universe, there was no neutral. Without sacrifice, the sun might fall, the stars might vanish, time itself might end. And so, in the dark recesses of memory, the people mourned not just their gods, but the order those gods had maintained. They mourned the machinery of meaning, the cosmic calendar, the sacred architecture, the drumbeat that had kept the universe alive. It is tempting to dismiss it now, to view it as primitive or cruel, but to do so is to miss the point. The Aztecs believed the world was dangerous, unpredictable, and in need of constant spiritual maintenance. They did not separate the sacred from the political, or the divine from the economic. Everything was connected. Everything required sacrifice. And in their temples, beneath obsidian blades, they offered the only thing they truly owned, their hearts. Tenochtitlan is gone. The canals are filled, the causeways paved over. The great twin temples of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, once the spiritual lungs of the empire, were torn down stone by stone, their remnants recycled into churches whose bells now ring over a conquered lakebed. But listen carefully, and you'll still hear it. Not drums, not chants, not the roar of warriors in eagle feathers, or the grinding snarl of obsidian on bone. Something quieter, more stubborn. You'll hear Nahuatl, the Aztec language still spoken by over 1 million people across Mexico. You'll hear words they gave us: chocolate, tomato, coyote, avocado, chili. You'll walk the streets of modern-day Mexico City and find names that reach back into that blood-soaked past. Tlalpan, Iztapalapa, Mixcoac. Names not erased. Names that refuse. What remains of Moctezuma's world is not a city. It is memory in motion. But memory is a complicated thing. The Spanish tried to bury it, burned the codices, banned the ceremonies, demolished the statues. They damned the temples as satanic, rebranded the gods as demons, the rituals as savagery. They renamed Tenochtitlan Mexico, a variation of Mexica, the name the Aztecs once gave themselves. And yet, the empire they erased became the very foundation of their colony. The lake was drained, but the grid of Tenochtitlan remained. The center of modern Mexico City still follows the logic of the old capital, the same symmetry, the same sacred axis from temple to palace. Under the cathedral near the Zocalo lie the stones of the Templo Mayor, not metaphorically but literally. You can still see them, touch them. Archaeologists began excavating them in the late 20th century. What they found was staggering. Serpent heads, sacrificial platforms, altars once soaked in the blood of warriors and children. But it's not just stone. It's bones. Thousands upon thousands of bones. And offerings, masks, jade, blades of glassy obsidian, so sharp they can still slice a hair. Statues of gods who were never truly silenced, only buried. Moctezuma's world lies just beneath the surface, both geologically and culturally, a second skin under the city's concrete face. And it haunts, because his was a world too complex to cleanly destroy. The Aztec Empire was not just war and sacrifice, it was astronomy and architecture, law and poetry, botany, philosophy, theology. It was one of the most literate societies in the pre-Columbian world, with professional scribes, libraries, and a sophisticated writing system that combined glyphs with pictorial art. They tracked eclipses, predicted the motion of Venus, designed floating gardens capable of feeding 100,000 people. They wrote love poems. They debated ethics. And for centuries, those achievements were reduced to a single word: savage. But the deeper archaeologists dig, the more that word withers. In the remains of palaces, they find murals of hummingbirds and sunbursts. In buried homes, obsidian razors next to polished mirrors. In skull racks and sacrificial stones, not just gore, but structure, purpose, belief. Even the codices that survived, rescued, copied, sometimes rewritten by friars, speak of nuance. Pages of festivals, calendars, taxes, medicine, gods. In the Codex Mendoza, we see the lists of tribute collected from subject cities, not in gold, but in tunics, maize, warriors. In the Florentine Codex, a massive collaborative document created by the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún and Nahua elders, we see daily life described in extraordinary detail: childbirth, cooking, farming, marriage, illness, mourning. We hear the voices of the conquered, and they do not sound broken. They sound complicated. What's remarkable is how much survived. Not just underground, but in people. In the highlands of central Mexico, Nahua communities still perform rituals that mirror ancient festivals, slightly Christianized, slightly masked, but unmistakable in origin. Masks of jaguars, dances that trace solar paths, prayers whispered in Nahuatl to saints who share more than a passing resemblance to old gods. Even Catholicism, in Mexico, carries Aztec fingerprints. The Virgin of Guadalupe, a dark-skinned mother goddess who appeared on a hill once sacred to Tonantzin, the Mother Earth deity. A coincidence, perhaps, but one layered in irony. The Spanish brought a new religion, yes, but its most beloved icon in the New World bore the face of the old. Moctezuma himself has become a kind of mirror. Some see him as a coward, a ruler too paralyzed by prophecy to act. Others see a tragic figure, intelligent, spiritual, caught between cosmic expectations and an unknowable future. Some Mexican nationalists reframe him as a martyr, others as a warning. His face appears in murals, textbooks, coins, graffiti. His name still carries weight. It is etched into memory through medicine too. Montezuma's Revenge. The nickname for a traveller's stomach illness is a crude joke born from colonial guilt. The conquered king, vomiting vengeance from the grave. Yet the real revenge is subtler. It is in the architecture of the city that erased him, the rituals that persist, the words that cannot be erased, the faces in the crowd that still carry the blood of priests and poets and jaguar knights. His world was shattered, but not lost, because an empire built on stone, smoke, and song does not vanish in a single lifetime. It lingers, in myths retold, in gods renamed, in flowers placed on altars by people who do not remember why, only that they must. It lingers in the language, in the dirt beneath the cathedral, in the calendar that still governs harvest, in the bloodlines that still whisper dreams of golden cities and shimmering lakes. Moctezuma ruled an empire of faith and fire, and though the fire has dimmed, its embers still glow, waiting. You are not sure when the first foot hit the cobblestone. It might have been early morning, the city still quiet, church bells not yet rung, or maybe late afternoon, when the sun has turned the stone streets soft with heat and the air hangs thick with flies. But what you do remember clearly, unbearably, is that it began with a woman named Frau Trophia. She stepped into the street with bare feet, one arm swinging, the other tucked against her chest, and she danced. Not joyfully, not in celebration, not for music. She moved like a puppet, pulled by unseen strings, awkward, jerking, frantic, her eyes wide and blank as if they saw something far away. You watched from your window. You weren't the only one. A butcher leaned on his doorway, squinting. Children ran up, laughed, then backed away. Someone shouted, "Witch!" but not very loud. No one went near her. At first it seemed like a performance, an act, a joke maybe. A poor woman overtaken by heat or grief. She would tire, fall, get up, wander away. But she didn't. She danced until nightfall, and then through the night, and then into the next day, and the day after that. No food, no sleep, no music, just that same compulsive movement, the arms, the knees, the dragging feet, the fevered gaze, her shoes filled with blood, her lips cracked from thirst. Her limbs twitched like she was trying to shake something loose from her bones. And then others joined her. At first one, then 3, then a dozen. Within days, nearly 30 people filled the street outside the church of St. Vitus, spinning, stomping, swaying, collapsing from exhaustion, only to rise again, possessed by some invisible rhythm that no one else could hear. You stood at the edge of the crowd, mouth dry. Someone whispered that it was plague. Another said it was mass hysteria. A priest nearby clutched his crucifix and muttered that it was divine punishment for vanity, for lust, for pride. You watched a man dance until he fell flat on his face. He twitched again, then was still. Someone dragged him away. Another filled his place, stepping into the same beat. There is no music, and yet their bodies jerk with precision, as if they're trapped inside a hymn you can't hear. The smell grows thick of sweat, of blood, of fear. The town physician says it is not demonic. He says it is humoral imbalance. Too much hot blood. He prescribes movement to purge the body. So, they build a stage. Yes, a real stage. With musicians. You don't believe it at first, but it's true. The city elders, desperate to calm the hysteria, order the town musicians to play. Pipes, drums, lutes. They think maybe, just maybe, this madness is theatrical and can be completed like a ritual. You stand in the square and watch them play. The flutes whine, the drums thump, and the dancers, the afflicted, move faster. It is unbearable to watch. A mother dances while her child weeps behind her. A boy, no older than 10, spins until he vomits, then stumbles back into rhythm. A man rips his shirt, clawing at his chest between steps, as if trying to dig something out. The priest says it's Saint Vitus, that the saint has cursed the town, that we are being punished for mockery and indulgence. He leads a procession, holy water, hymns, whipping. Still they dance. Some collapse, some die. Heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, broken limbs, heat stroke, crushed lungs. The death toll rises. The musicians stop playing, but the dancing continues. You begin to dream of it. In sleep, you hear footsteps on stone. Even when the street is empty, you see Frau Trofia's eyes, wide, glazed, looking through you. You wonder if you will wake up dancing. Others try to stop it. Some of the afflicted are bound with ropes, locked in cellars, chained to beds. They scream, not in words, in rhythm. Their feet stomp against the stone, even as their ankles twist. You hear the sounds echo down alleys like distant drums. The city council meets. Again and again. They argue. Is it demonic? Is it a disease? Is it God? Is it wheat? Yes, wheat. Someone says it could be ergot, a mold that grows on rye, filled with hallucinogenic properties, a poison in the bread. It makes sense, and yet the millers deny it. And besides, not everyone who ate the bread dances, only some. A stranger arrives, a healer from another town. He wears beads and carries herbs. He speaks of mass possession, of curses, of ancestral wounds rising from the soil. He's chased out by the priest, who declares him a pagan. The bishop bans dancing. Orders all afflicted taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the Vosges Mountains. A final solution. You see them carried away, pale, shaking, bandaged feet wrapped in cloth, soaked with vinegar and rosewater. Some scream, some weep, some just hum, low and hollow, as if trying to keep the rhythm alive. And then it ends. It doesn't stop suddenly, just fades. By September, the square is quiet again. No more stomping, no more shrieking. The musicians return to funerals. The priest gives thanks. The city pretends it never happened. But you remember the way the air trembled when 50 people moved in unison without music. You remember the sound of footsteps, hundreds in the dead of night. You remember the look in Frau Trofia's eyes, the first to dance, the first to fall. You never see her again. Some say she died, others say she wandered into the forest and kept dancing, alone, until the wolves found her. You don't know what it was. Mass hysteria, ergotism, psychogenic illness, repressed grief in a time of famine, war, and plague. Maybe it was all of them. Maybe it was grief given legs. The Holy Roman Empire had known war, pestilence, starvation, bodies piled like firewood in bad years. And there were no words left for suffering. No prayers, just movement, mindless, terrified. And that summer in Strasbourg, when words failed, the people danced. They danced until their bones cracked, until their lungs burst, until death itself begged for silence. They still don't agree on what happened. More than 500 years have passed since the summer of dancing death gripped Strasbourg in 1518, and yet no single theory has managed to box it in. It resists clean answers. Like the afflicted themselves, the mystery twists, staggers, and refuses to sit still. Was it poison? Was it madness? Was it grief? Or was it something no diagnosis can contain, something human, ancient, and terrifying in its familiarity? The first explanation to gain traction in modern times was ergotism. The idea is almost elegant in its simplicity. The dancers were poisoned. A fungus called Claviceps purpurea infects rye grain and, when consumed, produces hallucinogenic effects similar to LSD tremors, convulsions, visions. It's a real condition, documented. Deadly. Known historically as St. Anthony's fire for the burning sensation it causes in the limbs. At first glance, it makes perfect sense. A bad rye harvest, bread contaminated, entire neighborhoods affected. But the theory frays quickly under scrutiny. Ergot poisoning typically produces constriction, not rhythmic motion. Victims writhe, seize, claw. They don't stand upright and dance for days on end. More importantly, it doesn't affect only some people who shared the same grain, and it doesn't fade on cue when the afflicted are marched to a shrine. Ergot, in short, doesn't explain the timing, the shape, or the social contagion of the plague. So attention shifted to something more elusive, the mind. Could it have been mass hysteria? Psychologists prefer the term mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which a group of people, often under extreme stress, begin to manifest physical symptoms with no clear physiological cause: trembling, fainting, paralysis, convulsions, laughter, crying, movement. In the case of Strasbourg, the context fits. The Holy Roman Empire in 1518 was a cauldron of suffering. Famine had swept the region in prior years. Disease stalked the cities. The harvests had failed. Inflation gnawed at the poor. Plague still haunted the shadows of every alley. And then there was faith. Deep, visceral, unshakable, the kind of faith that lived in bone and blood. In Strasbourg, St. Vitus was the patron invoked against neurological disorders, especially trembling and compulsive movement. People prayed to him for healing when their limbs betrayed them. His name had power, and power shapes reality. So when Frau Trophia stepped into the street, barefoot and twitching, her neighbors didn't see illness. They saw a sign, a spiritual signal, a cosmic warning. And that's the terrifying thing about belief. It spreads. The dancing moved through the city, not like a disease, but like a meme before memes had a name. One person, then two, then dozens, not faking, not performing, but genuinely unable to stop. Their bodies overtaken by a cultural script they didn't even know they knew. It wasn't theatre, it was a psychogenic cascade. Modern parallels are unnervingly easy to find. In 1962, at a girls' boarding school in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, a strange phenomenon erupted. One girl began laughing uncontrollably, then another, then more than 90 students were affected. Some laughed for hours, others cried. Some fainted. The school was shut down. Doctors found no physical cause. Or go further back to the Middle Ages, when meowing nuns, entire convents full of cloistered women began mimicking animal noises, spasming and biting. Authorities blamed demons. Historians now blame pressure, social constraint, repression, loneliness. It turns out the human mind, especially when stressed, will find a way to break. And sometimes it chooses rhythm. So perhaps the dancing plague of 1518 wasn't poison or punishment. Perhaps it was a pressure valve, a scream too large for the throat, a shudder that overtook an entire city like a weather system. But even this answer isn't satisfying. It doesn't explain the stamina, the sheer endurance. Some danced for days, pausing only to collapse, sleep, and rise again, not once, not twice, but over and over. Bodies don't usually allow that. Muscles cramp, tendons rupture, feet shred, and yet they danced. It also doesn't explain why dancing, specifically, why not fits, or moaning, or paralysis? Why did the body move? Some anthropologists suggest it was ritual memory. Strasbourg had a tradition of dancing processions, particularly for Saint Vitus. Pilgrims had, for generations, marched to his shrines in coordinated movement, sometimes to ward off illness, sometimes in penance. Maybe what happened in 1518 wasn't entirely spontaneous. Maybe it was the return of an old cultural pattern, distorted by fear and pain, like an echo misheard, a liturgy misremembered. The dancing, then, would not be madness. It would be devotion, twisted through suffering. Still others turn to social theory. They argue that in a deeply hierarchical society, where peasants had no voice, no vote, no medicine, and no hope, the body became the only place left to protest. If words couldn't speak, maybe movement could. There's a dark poetry to that idea, that the oppressed would rise in unconscious rebellion, not with pitchforks, but with their feet. That Strasbourg's cobbled streets became a kind of unconscious stage, and the dancers unknowingly performed a play about agony, witnessed by a city too frightened to understand. But even this is guesswork. Every theory comes close, then falls short. Every answer leaves gaps. Perhaps that's why the story lingers, because it doesn't let us close the book. It forces us to confront the strange, shifting frontier between mind and body, faith and fear, order and collapse. And it warns us quietly, subtly, that under enough pressure, any society can begin to twitch. That madness doesn't need a virus. That grief can choreograph. And that sometimes, when the weight becomes too much, a city will do the only thing it can: move. Strasbourg, 1518, was not the first place where people danced until their feet bled, nor was it the last. Because long before modern minds tried to classify the phenomenon, long before words like psychogenic illness and neurological trauma existed, the act of dancing with death was already part of human culture. Across continents and centuries, people have turned to rhythm in the face of the unknowable. They have moved not just to celebrate life, but to confront its end. And what at first seems bizarre bodies spinning wildly in the face of plague, war, or famine becomes eerily consistent. We begin, as many things do, in ancient Greece. There, ecstatic dance was part of worship, particularly in the cult of Dionysus. Participants drank wine, beat drums, and whirled themselves into trances. They called it enthusiasmos, to be filled with the god. And in that state, boundaries dissolved. Person became presence. Flesh became symbol. Death was not banished. It was welcomed, flirted with, danced around like a fire. The Maenads, female followers of Dionysus, were said to reach such heights of divine frenzy that they could tear animals apart with bare hands. Historians debate whether this was literal or poetic, but the message is clear. Movement could unhinge the self and open a door to the divine. In India, the god Shiva is known as Nataraja, the lord of the dance. His cosmic performance is not a joyful jig. It is a cycle of creation and destruction, spinning within a ring of flame, crushing ignorance beneath his feet. His dance is the world's heartbeat, and when it stops, time itself ends. In West Africa, spiritual possession is often expressed through dance. In Vodun ceremonies, drummers summon deities, and practitioners enter a state of trance, bodies overtaken, eyes unfocused, voices changed. They move not of their own will, but through divine command. To an outsider, it may seem chaotic, but within the tradition, it is sacred choreography. Among the Yoruba, Bata drumming accompanies Orisha worship, where each deity has its own rhythm, a signature in sound, and when that rhythm is struck, the body answers. Possession is not sickness. It is communion. In Europe, the Middle Ages developed a different relationship with dance and death. During the Black Death, images began appearing on monastery walls, in church windows, in illuminated manuscripts, skeletons leading the living in a macabre chain, from pope to peasant, from king to child. This was the dance macabre, the dance of death. It was not literal, but allegorical. Death as the great equalizer, pulling all into its rhythm. No one escaped, but everyone, in art, was forced to dance. Yet in the centuries following, it did become literal. The flagellant movements of the 13th and 14th centuries saw groups of pilgrims, mostly men, often barefoot marching through towns in synchronized processions, whipping themselves to the sound of chants and bells. They danced, spun, and writhed in pain and piety, convinced that through suffering they could atone for the sins of all. Witnesses described them as moving like puppets, jerking, crying, collapsing. Sound familiar? Historians now believe the seeds of dancing mania were sown in these rituals. The idea that movement could exercise, that rhythm could cure, that the body, when pushed beyond exhaustion, might be cleansed. Even Christianity, with its suspicion of excess, couldn't fully outlaw the instinct. In medieval Spain, dances were held in cemeteries on All Souls' Day, not for celebration, but to honour the dead. In the Balkans, the kolo, a circle dance, is still performed at funerals. In parts of rural Italy, the tarantella was born from the belief that the bite of a spider, real or imagined, could only be cured by frenzied dancing, drums, tambourines, days of movement, not for joy. For survival, dance as antidote, as therapy, as ritual exorcism. So when the people of Strasbourg danced until their bodies broke, they were not inventing something new. They were performing an ancient archetype. They were moving in the footsteps of those who had come before and who still come, in other forms, to this day. Consider the rave. Modern, yes, neon-lit, bass-heavy. But look closely. Strangers gather in a dark space, lights strobe, bodies pulse in unison for hours, time distorts, identity loosens. Endorphins flood the blood, and when it ends, there is a kind of silence, a holy stillness, as if something has been lifted. In Bali, trance dancers still perform Sangyang Didari, in which prepubescent girls enter altered states believed to allow spirits to speak through them. They sway, with closed eyes, untouched by the coals burning beneath their feet. In Brazil's candomblé ceremonies, dancers invoke Oryx's divine spirits through precise movements, rhythms, and ritual songs. Possession is not feared, it is the point. Even in secular contexts, protest marches, football crowds, military drills movement binds us. It elevates us. It frees us. But what happens when that binding snaps? When the dance turns from communion to compulsion? When the line between choice and command disappears? That's what makes the dancing plague so frightening. Not that people moved, but that they couldn't stop. That their bodies became messages written in motion, illegible but unmistakable. That society itself, with all its strain and silence, had cracked just enough for something wild to pour through. Was it hysteria? Maybe. But hysteria is just the medical term for pain we don't understand. For grief we can't express. For longing we have no language for. And sometimes the body moves because the mind cannot speak. In that way, Strasbourg was not cursed. It was honest. A city of people trembling under centuries of religious guilt, political violence, plague, poverty, and fear, who in the heat of July began to move in the only way left to them. Feet first, hands open, eyes blank, a prayer with no words, a scream with no sound, a dance with no end. The dancers are long dead. The blood has dried, the cobblestones replaced, and Strasbourg, now a charming French city with Gothic cathedrals and quiet plazas, remembers the plague of 1518 only in whispers. No statue, no plaque, just a few academic references, a story told in half-joking tones, something strange that happened once, a long time ago. But the dance never truly ended, not in the way that matters, because the real weight of the dancing plague isn't in the number of people who died or the mystery of what caused it. It's in what it reveals about fear, about society, and about the fragile language of the human body when all other forms of speech fail. When we say, "they danced to death," we're not just speaking metaphorically. They danced until their knees shattered, until their souls split open, until their hearts gave out. They danced through blood and heat, humiliation and prayer. They danced because something ancient and heavy cracked open inside them, and there was no other way to let it out. And we're still trying to explain it, because we're terrified it might happen again. Not literally, not people pouring into the streets in unison, writhing to invisible music, though we shouldn't be so sure, but symbolically, psychologically, culturally. Because at its core, the dancing plague wasn't an isolated event. It was a moment of psychic rupture, a breakdown of normality, an eruption of unprocessed collective grief. And the modern world is full of grief we haven't processed. You see it in panic buying, in conspiracy spirals, in sudden acts of mass violence that make no rational sense, in entire communities seized by cultural obsessions that burn hot and inexplicably then vanish like smoke. We call these things viral as if they were biological, but maybe they're rhythmic. Maybe they're our own version of a dance we don't understand. This is what makes the dancing plague so enduringly disturbing. It blurs the line between the mental and the physical, the religious and the medical, the symbolic and the real. No theory can contain it. The scientists point to stress, the psychologists to trauma, the historians to ritual memory, the anthropologists to ecstatic tradition, and they're all partially right. But none of them answer the deeper question. What happens when the body becomes the only language left? What happens when a society silences its people so completely through hierarchy, religion, oppression, or fear that movement becomes rebellion, that exhaustion becomes expression, that collapse becomes communication. In that context, the dancing becomes a kind of exorcism, not of demons, of history, of expectation, of guilt, of silence. It's tempting to believe we've evolved beyond that kind of rupture, that modern medicine, psychology, and social freedoms have immunized us. But history is full of reminders that under the right pressure, the boundaries of self dissolve. We are not machines. We are symphonies of nerve and belief. We move when we don't understand. We move when we grieve. We move when we break. And when enough people move in the same way, for the same unspeakable reason, society has to make sense of it. So we call it a plague. We call it madness. We call it divine punishment. But what if it was a message? What if it is a message? That something isn't right. That something has built too much pressure, and the crack is coming. Because the dancing plague didn't begin with a curse. It began with one woman, Frau Trophia, one morning, one movement, one step into the street. No music, no madness, just motion. It took 3 days before anyone tried to stop her. By then, others had joined. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't agreed. Their bodies simply followed. Like tuning forks responding to a sound no one else could hear. That's the haunting part. Not the death, not the spectacle, but the possibility that it was contagion by recognition, that each person saw themselves in the dancer, and in that reflection felt something crack loose. You see that today in less dramatic ways. Online, when a phrase catches and becomes a movement, when a trend turns into an identity, when mass anxiety manifests as a cultural shift, sudden, inexplicable, and strangely rhythmic. We call it going viral. But viral is just the 21st century's way of saying plague. And sometimes that plague moves in feet. There's something deeply human about expressing suffering through motion. Grief doesn't like stillness. In funerals across the world, from Ghana to New Orleans, from rural Ireland to the Ganges, people move in mourning. They sway, they carry, they stagger, they dance, not for joy, but for ritual, for release, to say, this hurts, and we don't know what to do, so we move. And the danger comes when that movement is forbidden, when fear or shame or religion or social order says, be still, be silent, don't feel, don't flinch. Eventually, something gives. That was Strasbourg's mistake. The city tried to explain it, rationalize it, sanitize it. They brought in musicians, then doctors, then priests. They tried to make it normal, then tried to make it stop. But they never asked, what are they trying to say? And maybe that's why it ended the way it did, with a pilgrimage. Not a cure, a removal. Take them away. Bury the movement in the mountains. Pretend it never happened. But history remembers, and not just history. The body remembers, because we are flesh woven with memory, and some memories only release when the feet begin to move. So the next time your limbs twitch when music plays, the next time your heart races for no reason and your fingers tap in rhythm, the next time a crowd moves as one and you feel yourself swept along, remember Strasbourg. Remember the bodies. Remember that sometimes, when the words run out, we dance. They carried paintbrushes and speakers into war. Not rifles, not bayonets. Brushes, sound reels, and needles. Their mission wasn't to kill the enemy, it was to confuse them, to manipulate their eyes, ears, and instincts so thoroughly that they made the wrong move, shot at shadows, and gave up real ground to phantoms. They were the Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, one of the most unusual units in the history of the US military. And for much of World War II, they fought not with bullets, but with imagination. They were designers, stagehands, radio operators, fashion illustrators, architects, and they made war into theatre. The idea was simple: mislead the enemy. The execution? Brilliant. In the wake of day, as Allied forces pushed east through France, Belgium, and into Germany, the challenge wasn't just firepower, it was movement. Armies needed to advance quickly and strategically, and the Germans were watching every road, every hedgerow, every rail yard. If the enemy could see where a division was headed, or hear it, they could fortify, ambush, or retreat. What if, instead, the enemy saw an entire division forming to their south, when in truth the real soldiers were quietly flanking from the north? Enter the Ghost Army. It was a unit of just over 1,100 men, tasked with impersonating entire divisions, sometimes up to 30,000 troops, using props, recordings, and performance. The backbone of the operation was inflatable tanks. Yes, actual blow-up Sherman tanks made of rubber and canvas. Lightweight enough to be carried by 4 men, but realistic enough to fool aerial reconnaissance. From the sky, they looked authentic. Real treads, real gun barrels, real shadows. Trucks, too. Jeeps, artillery. Fake camps with fake laundry, drying on fake clotheslines. Soldiers moving in fake patterns. It was military cosplay on a massive scale. They called it tactical deception. But it was more than that. It was illusion warfare. And they didn't stop at visuals. They had sound engineers from Hollywood and RCA who lugged giant 1,200-pound speakers mounted on trucks. These rigs could blast recorded sounds of troop movement for miles. Clanking tanks, marching feet, hammering on steel, shouted orders. The audio was real, captured from actual army maneuvers, then carefully remixed to match the illusion. If they wanted to simulate a battalion rolling through a forest, they did. If they wanted to sound like an encampment building a bridge, they did. The sound was directional, layered, atmospheric. And the Germans believed it. But the deception didn't end with sight and sound. The Ghost Army went even deeper. Radio deception, known as spoof radio, was its own art. Specialists called operators mimicked the communication style of real divisions. They had studied the way certain officers spoke, their pacing, even their grammar. If the real 3rd Armoured Division was relocating, Ghost Army radio techs would continue transmitting their usual chatter, making it seem as if the division hadn't moved at all. Each radio call was part of a performance. Each Morse code tap an accent. And when those weren't enough, they used actors, literal performance-trained soldiers, to walk into towns, dressed as high-ranking officers, chatting loudly in cafes about the upcoming mission or where the 6th Division would be heading. Spies were everywhere. And if they heard that intel, they'd report it up the German chain of command, which is exactly what the Ghost Army wanted. The most famous deception came during Operation Viersen in March 1945. The Ghost Army was tasked with convincing the Germans that the main Allied crossing of the Rhine River would occur miles away from its actual location. For days, they set up an elaborate illusion. Inflatable tanks, roaring soundscapes, spoof radio, truck convoys that looped endlessly to simulate heavy traffic. They even dug fake trenches, and the Germans fell for it. They repositioned artillery and troops to the wrong location, giving General Patton's Third Army an easier path to cross and push deeper into Germany. It worked. Again and again, it worked. Because the Ghost Army understood something simple but devastating. In war, perception is power. They blurred the line between what is seen and what is real. And their work saved lives, though few knew it at the time. They weren't permitted to talk about what they were doing. Even fellow Allied soldiers were kept in the dark. Their mission was classified until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. Many took their secrets to the grave. But the art remained. Among the members of the Ghost Army were men who would go on to shape American culture. Fashion illustrator Bill Blass, who built an empire in post-war haute couture. Photographer Art Kane, who later captured iconic portraits of Louis Armstrong and Bob Dylan. Painter Ellsworth Kelly, whose geometric abstractions would hang in the world's finest galleries. They weren't killers. They were artists. Artists who turned deception into defense. Their gear was cobbled together with paint, rubber, and ingenuity. Their weapons were doubt and misdirection. They didn't fire first. They didn't fire at all. And yet, they helped defeat one of history's most brutal regimes. That contradiction is part of what makes their story so haunting. Because war is supposed to be brutal, loud, bloody. But here were men lying on their backs in muddy fields, hand-painting tire tracks to match an imaginary convoy. Here were men filling dog tags with fake names, creating entire backstories for soldiers who didn't exist. Here were men sewing shoulder patches onto their uniforms for divisions they'd never served in, just to complete the ruse. In some ways, the Ghost Army was the opposite of Strasbourg's dancers. In Strasbourg, the mind broke and the body followed. But in the Ghost Army, the body performed so well that the mind, the enemy's mind, was tricked. Both were theatre. Both were collective. Both were forms of survival. And both remind us of a truth we often forget. Reality can be rewritten with enough conviction. Today, most of the Ghost Army has passed on. But in 2022, they were finally recognized by the US Congress with the Congressional Gold Medal. Too late for most, but not for memory. And now, deep in the archives of history, their work is being studied not just by military tacticians, but by psychologists, designers, filmmakers, because what they did wasn't just clever, it was visionary. In a world where we are constantly bombarded by illusion, deepfakes, misinformation, manipulation, the Ghost Army was the prototype. But unlike today's deceivers, their lies saved lives. They remind us that creativity can be a weapon. That illusion, when used for good, can outmatch brute force. And that sometimes, to protect the truth, you have to become a ghost. The war ended, but the ghosts remained. Not in trenches or graveyards, though there were plenty of those, but in the minds of those who had built the war out of smoke and mirrors, the artists, the sound engineers, the stage designers and sign painters who had created entire armies from canvas and air. They had marched alongside real soldiers, but their story was hidden for decades. Their names weren't in textbooks. Their unit had no medals. Even among fellow veterans, they were often silent. How do you explain that your weapon was a rubber tank, that your battle station was behind a speaker truck, cueing artillery sounds on vinyl while your friends were in foxholes. Some never did. The Ghost Army's mission was declassified in 1996. Until then, its veterans were legally forbidden from speaking about what they had done. Some died with that silence. Others, once freed to tell their stories, struggled to convince anyone it had even happened. It sounded too absurd. But the documents were real. The photos were real. The reels of audio deception, the sketches, the maps, the sewn-on patches of imaginary divisions, all of it real. And perhaps more importantly, the outcomes were real. Dozens of successful operations. Countless enemy movements redirected. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Allied soldiers spared from walking into fire because a German commander believed what his eyes told him, not what was true. It worked because it played to a fundamental human instinct. Trust what you see, trust what you hear. And if war is anything, it is the exploitation of instinct. That's the uncomfortable truth that lies at the heart of the Ghost Army's legacy. That war is not just blood and bullets, it is theatre, misdirection, performance. And sometimes, the most ethical thing you can do in war is to lie well enough that no one has to die at all. But that truth comes with questions. If illusion is acceptable in wartime, where does the boundary lie? Is it still noble when the purpose is survival? Or does it become manipulation? When the Ghost Army painted fake tank tracks in a Belgian field to trick the Luftwaffe, they saved lives. When modern militaries use deepfake technology or social engineering to destabilize governments, we call it psychological warfare. What's the difference? The Ghost Army was crafted for good, to deceive, in service of a just cause, but the technique has outlived its makers. Today, militaries around the world invest in information warfare, AI-generated personas, false flag operations, and synthetic speech that can mimic a world leader's voice with perfect pitch. The battlefield has moved into the mind. And in that world, the Ghost Army stands like a prototype, a flickering black and white photograph of something that was once quaint but now feels prophetic. They were artists, yes, but they were also soldiers, and that duality defines their strange, beautiful contradiction, because they chose to use their creativity not to entertain, but to protect. They weren't glorified set designers. They were warriors of illusion men who understood that sometimes the best way to win a war is not to fight it head on, but to make the enemy believe they've already lost. They created the illusion of overwhelming force, and in doing so, they prevented the need to prove it. This is the paradox of deception, that a well-crafted lie can be the most humane path through a violent world. But it only works if the audience believes. That belief is fragile. And in the 21st century, it has become currency. Fake news, disinformation campaigns, artificially generated videos, these aren't props in fields anymore. They're digital, global, and instant. And unlike the Ghost Army, modern deception doesn't come with a moral compass. The Ghost Army operated under strict ethical constraints. They were not to endanger civilians. Their work was designed to prevent bloodshed, not provoke it. Can we say the same today? What happens when illusion is weaponized without conscience? What happens when the ghost no longer knows who it's haunting? In their quiet way, the men of the Ghost Army offered a blueprint for responsible deception. A contradiction in terms, maybe, but one worth considering. They asked, how can we use the tools of trickery to save, rather than destroy? They did not claim glory. They left no trail of bodies. They marched in, set the stage, changed the game, and vanished, leaving behind only confusion, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a German division pointing its guns in the wrong direction. And that's the strange beauty of their war. It was invisible unless you knew where to look. A shift in tire tracks, a too-perfect shadow beneath a rubber tank, a radio voice that sounded just a little too scripted. They were ghosts not of the dead, but of possibility, of what war might look like if imagination took the lead. Today, the world remembers them in fragments. A canvas tank on display in a museum, a scratchy audio tape of marching boots echoing through a French forest, a photo of a young man crouched beside a loudspeaker, brush in hand, helmet askew. These are their monuments. And in a world where deception is increasingly cheap, cruel, and anonymous, where lies spread faster than truth, and illusions are crafted not to protect, but to dominate, their legacy stands as something rare. A deception born of mercy. A trick played to preserve life. A war waged not with fire, but with shadows. They remind us that sometimes the best warriors are not those who aim straight, but those who can make you aim somewhere else entirely,